Hi, this is Tom Watson with In It to Win It. Good news is we've gotten our pistons in from Carrillo, so we'll be able to get started on getting this bottom end put together and getting it ready to go. We didn't make it in time to go to Talladega Short Track, but we are hopefully going to be able to get it ready to go to Boyd Speedway. So we're going to Boyd Speedway for the Cabin Fever, and my plan is to have this engine in the 2013 CRS car to go to Boyd Speedway. So let's get these pistons out of the way, and the first thing that we will do is we'll start checking our bearing clearances on the bottom end of this engine. Make sure that the crankshaft, all the main bearings, and as we put in our pistons and put those on the connecting rods, that all of our bearing clearances are correct. That's the first thing that we want to check. So we'll go ahead and start removing these main bearing caps. This is a 4-bolt main caps on each of these. They each have 4 bolts on the main caps. We'll remove the outer bolts first and then the inner bolts next. And we'll start working from the outside to the inside whenever we're taking it apart, and then whenever we put it back together, we'll work from the inside to the outside, going to put it back together and to torque down the bolts for the main bearing caps. The reason that we do that is because the crankshaft is very flexible. Well, not very flexible, but it is flexible, and the kind of torque that you're putting on these caps will tend to make it flex somewhat. So that's why you start in the middle and work outwards whenever you're tightening it down, and whenever you take it apart, you work from the outside to the inside. Okay, doing this will also allow us to inspect these bearings. So we want to take these caps off and inspect the bearings as we go. You can just rock the bearing cap kind of side to side to get it loose and pull it off. Okay, we've taken a look at all the bearing caps, and we've taken a look at each of the bearings to make sure that there's no significant wear on those that would cause us any concerns, and there weren't on any of these bearings. So the next thing that we'll do is we'll clean up the bearing surfaces and clean up the crankshaft surface itself, and we'll use a tool called a Plastigage to look and see what our bearing clearances are. And that's really going to give us the final decision as to whether or not we can use this as is. Now we'll put on our safety glasses, use a little bit of brake cleaner to clean off the bearing surfaces of the crank. This is just to prepare it for the Plastigage. Now what we'll use to check our bearing clearances is some Plastigage, where bearing clearances should be right around 2 thousandths. And we will check it with this Plastigage to make sure that is the case. You can see this Plastigage is 1 to 3 thousandths on this particular Plastigage, and it's got a little plastic piece in there, and this is the gauge that you use to measure how much it's been smashed. The way we use this Plastigage is we just take and cut it a little piece off. And then we take the piece out of the pack. Get a close-up look at this. What looks like a little piece of thread or in there. Just use that. And what you will do with that is we will take it and lay it down on our bearing cap surface. Now these bearing caps have a particular direction to them, and they're also numbered. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the rear bearing cap doesn't have a number on it, but it's unique from the others because it has the retainer for the rear main seal. So we count and see that we're going to be doing the center one, which is the 1, 2, 3, the third journal. So we'll use our number 3 cap, and then it's got a little arrow that's on there pointing and telling you to place that little arrow pointing towards the front of the block. Now it's good for your bolts to have just a slight amount of oil. You never want to take and torque down a bolt without a little bit of oil in the threads. We'll just go ahead and snug up all 4 bolts first before we torque them. So then we'll take and torque down the bolts on the main cap, starting with the inside and going to the outside. And then we'll remove it and check our bearing clearances with the Plastigage. So the inside bolts, we looked up this online and got the instruction sheet for the Ford 351 race block instruction sheet. It shows you that the torque on the inside bolts are 95 to 105 foot-pounds. Torque on the outside bolts is 34 to 45 foot-pounds. So what we'll do is we'll torque the inside bolts to 100 foot-pounds, torque the outside bolts to 45 foot-pounds. We'll start with the inside bolts and then do the outside bolts. This is our torque wrench here. So what you will do is just match that 0 line up with the center line running up, and then it'll match up to the 100 that's on the side. Place your foot just to hold the thing in place. Kind of put a little even pressure on it. Pull some on this one. And pull some on the other. So it goes down nice and steady and even. $100. $100. We'll just do it twice. $100. $100. One more time. Nice and consistent. And for the outer bolts, we'll use this smaller 3/8 drive torque wrench to set it down to 45 foot-pounds. We'll use a deep weld socket to give us a little clearance pass here since these are splayed caps. Place it down here, place our foot here on it to keep it from moving around. If you have one with a locking wheel, you don't have to put your foot on it, but that's okay. We don't have a locking wheel on it, but just put our foot on it to kind of hold it steady. And place our body up against it. Then we'll take and remove the cap and then measure our bearing clearance. Now that we have the main cap off, we'll take and check our bearing clearance with this. There's like a lighter colored line and then a darker colored that gives you each one. It's 3 thousandths, 2 thousandths, 15 thousandths, 1 thousandths. Obviously, the wider that the Plastigage is pressed across means that the bearing clearance is tighter, or more like 15 thousandths, whereas if it's smaller, then it's closer to the 3 thousandths. So we'll just measure this. There's a lighter line, darker line for each one of those. And just placing it on here, comes in right about 2 thousandths, somewhere between 2 and 3 thousandths. So we'll just call it 25.025 for the bearing clearance. Now, since that bearing clearance was good for us, we'll take and torque this center cap back down, and then we'll work out all the way to the end until we have all of these checked and torqued down. What we'll do is we'll take this high flex gasket maker made by Loctite, and we'll apply a very thin bead just to the outer edge of this one-piece rear main seal, and then that'll give us an extra little layer of protection from having a leak in this area here. Just a nice little thin even bead across it, and then we'll take our finger and just smooth it out. And then what I like to do at the end is just go back over all the bearing caps, make sure that everything is torqued down to spec. So we'll just start and go with the torque pattern, starting with the middle. You just hear that nice click. And then we'll just torque the outer, starting with the middle. And then here is a kind of a final check. We just take and rotate our crankshaft around by hand. You can see it's spinning around nice and easy in here. That's a good sign, very good indication. Just spinning around real nice and easy. Don't feel any bad spots. And there you have it. All the bearing clearances checked on all of our main bearings. Everything torque specs. So we're ready to go and move on to the next step, which is to install the pistons onto the rods, and then install that whole assembly in, then attach it to the crankshaft, and then torque down our rod bearing caps to specs. And we'll do the same thing again, is we'll take and we'll check each bearing to make sure that it has the proper amount of clearance. Thank you so much for joining in, and I look forward to seeing you on the next session.